In the autumn of 2023, a federal recall notice was issued for every single bushel of corn harvested in Garrison County, Iowa. The grain elevators were sealed, the trucks were turned away. 11.4 million bushels, representing an entire year's work for 57 farming families, were declared unfit for human or animal consumption. Their value reduced overnight from $52 million to a disposal liability of negative $8 million. Every single bushel, that is, except for the 12,040 harvested by Silas Blackwood from his 70 acres. His was the only crop safe. This story is not about how Silas was right, but about the cost of being wrong for the right reasons. To understand how this happened, you have to go back 20 years, to the spring of 2003. It was a cool April evening, the kind where the frost still threatens the new shoots of alfalfa. The Garrison County Grange Hall was packed. Fluorescent lights hummed over the heads of 150 farmers, men and women whose faces were maps of sun and worry. They sat on folding metal chairs that scraped against the linoleum floor, a sound like collective anxiety. At the front of the room stood Mark Jensen. He was 28 years old, had been with the agricultural biotech firm Agrogen for 4 years, and was known for his unshakable confidence. He wore a crisp blue shirt, no tie, and a belief in data that was as solid and unyielding as a concrete silo. He was not there to sell them something. He was there to offer them the future. Let me tell you about the future Mark Jensen was offering, because it was a beautiful one. It was called Sunstone 9. It was a hybrid corn seed, the result of a $150 million research and development program. On the projector screen behind him, a slide showed 2 corn cobs side by side. On the left was a cob of standard commodity corn, respectable but inconsistent. On the right was Sunstone 9. It was perfect. Every kernel was the same size, arranged in 18 straight rows. It was an image of order, of control. Mark spoke in the calm, assured tones of a man who held undeniable facts. The county average yield right now, he said, pointing a laser at a chart, is 165 bushels per acre. That's a good number. You should be proud of it. But Sunstone 9 is averaging 220 bushels in our test plots. That's a 33% increase. A low murmur went through the room. A 33% increase wasn't just profit. It was a new truck, a college tuition, a life where the bank wasn't a constant, silent partner. He went on. Sunstone 9 was engineered for drought tolerance. It was coated with an exclusive fungicide and insecticide package, Guardian Coat, that protected the seedling in its most vulnerable stage. And it was a Roundup-ready crop, meaning you could spray for weeds without harming the corn itself. It was a complete system, an elegant solution to the chaotic, unpredictable business of farming. The men in the room, men who had spent their lives guessing at the rain and fighting the blight, saw not just a seed, but an escape from uncertainty. The questions they asked were practical. How much per bag? $240, which was $90 more than standard seed. What were the planting density recommendations? 34,000 seeds per acre, up from the usual 28,000. Was special equipment needed? No, it would run through their existing planters. For an hour, Mark Jensen fielded their questions with charts and data, his confidence never wavering. He was not a snake oil salesman. He was a missionary of progress, and he believed in his gospel. Then, from the back of the room, a voice. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the hum. Can you save the seed? The room went quiet. All eyes turned to Silas Blackwood. He was 52 years old then, had been farming the same 300 acres his grandfather bought in 1919 for 35 years, and was known for his silence. He was wearing a worn denim jacket over a plaid shirt, and he held his hands clasped in his lap, the knuckles thick from a lifetime of work. His question hung in the air, simple and profound. Mark Jensen smiled, a patient, practiced smile. That's a great question, Silas, and the answer is no. Sunstone 9 is an F1 hybrid. That means its genetic traits, the high yield, the drought tolerance, are only present in the first generation. If you were to save seed from your harvest, the next year's crop would be wildly unpredictable. It would revert. You'd see a huge drop in yield. He clicked to a new slide. To guarantee the 220 bushel performance, you need to buy fresh, certified seed from us each season. That's how we ensure the quality and consistency you're paying for. It's a feature of the system. Silas nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Mark. He didn't say anything else, but in that nod, a decision was made. The other farmers saw a feature. Silas saw a lock. The other farmers saw a guarantee. Silas saw a dependency. When the meeting ended, 56 farmers signed up for delivery of Sunstone 9 seed. Their orders totaled 4,800 bags, enough to plant over 19,000 acres, nearly every cornfield in Garrison County. Silas Blackwood bought none. He went home, walked out to his machine shed, and ran his hand over a canvas bag hanging from a wooden peg. Let me tell you about that bag. It was made of heavy, off-white canvas, stitched with thick flaxen thread. The seams were sewn by his grandmother, Eleanor Blackwood, in the winter of 1948. She'd made it to replace the flour sack his grandfather had been using. It wasn't just a container, it was an archive. Inside it was the seed for Garrison Gold, an open-pollinated variety of corn that had been grown on their farm for 84 years. It had no patent, no trademark. Its breeder was the Blackwood family, and the wind and the land itself. Garrison Gold was not beautiful in the way Sunstone 9 was. It was not uniform. In the field, some stalks stood a full foot taller than their neighbors. Some produced a single, massive ear, while others produced two smaller ones. The kernels were not all the same shade of yellow. Some were a pale cream, others a deep, almost orange gold. To an agronomist, it was a mess. It was inefficient, but to Silas and his father before him, it was resilient. That genetic diversity, the very thing modern breeding sought to eliminate, was its strength. In a dry year, the shorter stalks with deeper roots would find water and produce a crop. In a wet year, the taller stalks would thrive, their leaves reaching for the sun. The corn was not optimized for a single, ideal condition. It was adapted for a range of real ones. Every fall, after the harvest was in, Silas would walk his fields. Not the edges, where cross-pollination from a neighbor's crop might have occurred, but deep into the center of his 70 acres of corn. He would walk for hours, looking, feeling. He would select the 200 best ears of corn based on a set of criteria that existed not on a spreadsheet, but in his hands and in his memory. He looked for ears that were well filled to the tip, with deep kernels and straight rows. He looked for stalks that had stood strong against the wind, whose leaves were still green, showing disease resistance. He was selecting not just for yield, but for health, for vigor, for a plant that belonged to that specific soil in that specific climate. He would take those 200 ears, shell them by hand, and mix the seed together in the old canvas bag. This was his research and development program. It cost him nothing but time and attention. It was a conversation between a man, a plant, and a piece of ground. A conversation that had been going on for nearly a century. The first 5 years after Mark Jensen's visit were hard on Silas. The stories of Sunstone 9's performance were real. His neighbor to the west, Frank Miller, harvested 218 bushels per acre his first year. The farmer to the east, Tom Gallagher, hit 224. They bought new combines, new tractors. Their wives drove new SUVs. Their farms looked like magazine covers, perfect emerald carpets of uniform stalks. Silas's Garrison Gold, meanwhile, yielded its usual 168 bushels. The difference was stark. On 70 acres, it was a gap of nearly 4,000 bushels. At $3.50 a bushel, that was $14,000. It was a number that kept his son, Thomas, awake at night. Thomas was 18 in 2003, and by 2008 he was 23, working full-time on the farm after a 2-year degree in agronomy from the community college. He saw his father as a stubborn, prideful man, clinging to the past while the future drove by in a brand-new John Deere 9770. The arguments at their kitchen table became a ritual. "Dad, Frank Miller just cleared $800 an acre. We cleared $550. We can't keep this up, Thomas would say, his voice tight with frustration. He'd have printouts from the university extension, spreadsheets he'd made himself. Silas would sit there, stirring his coffee, looking out the window at the fields. He would listen patiently. Then he would say, "Our costs are lower, son. We don't buy seed. We use less nitrogen. We don't pay for the technology fee." "It's not enough," Thomas would snap back. "The math doesn't work. We're falling behind. People in town think we're fools." The arguments always ended the same way. Silas would look at his son, not with anger, but with a deep, weary sadness. "We're not farming for 1 year, Thomas," he'd say, his voice quiet. "We're farming for the next 100. To Thomas, it sounded like an excuse, a romantic justification for failure. He didn't understand that his father was talking about a different kind of math, a different kind of wealth. The first crack in the beautiful facade of Sunstone 9 appeared in the summer of 2009. It was a dry year, not a catastrophic drought, but a long, hot spell in July when the corn was pollinating. Rain didn't fall for 28 straight days. The temperature stayed above 95 degrees Fahrenheit. The fields of Sunstone 9, bred for ideal conditions with ample water, began to suffer. The leaves curled up during the day to conserve moisture, a sign of severe stress. The shallow root systems, accustomed to readily available fertilizer and water, struggled to reach the subsoil moisture. Silas's fields of Garrison Gold looked stressed too, but they looked different. The genetic diversity meant the plants responded in different ways. Some curled their leaves, but others, the ones with the deep root genetics from the Dust Bowl years, stayed green. They were tapping into a deeper memory, a deeper source of water. When the harvest came that fall, the numbers told a new story. The county average for Sunstone 9, which had by then been upgraded to Sunstone 12, dropped to 142 bushels per acre. Silas's Garrison Gold yielded 151 bushels. For the first time in 6 years, his crop was more productive, and his profit margin was significantly higher. He had spent $115 less per acre on seed and inputs. That year, Silas Blackwood cleared $100 more per acre than his neighbors. It wasn't a windfall. It was just a quiet, factual statement made by the land itself. Thomas didn't celebrate, but he stopped arguing at the kitchen table. He started watching. Let me tell you about soil, because the story of the seed is also the story of the ground it grows in. The AgriGen system was a hungry one. The high-yield hybrids demanded high inputs, massive amounts of synthetic nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The constant application of glyphosate herbicide killed the weeds, but it also had a less advertised effect on the microbial life in the soil. The earthworms disappeared. The fungi that helped plant roots access nutrients vanished. The soil on the neighboring farms began to change. It lost its structure, its dark, crumbly texture. It became compacted, lifeless. When it rained hard, the water would sheet off the surface, taking topsoil and expensive fertilizer with it into the ditches. It was becoming a hydroponic medium, a dead substrate that did little more than prop up the plants. Silas's soil was different. He practiced a 7-year rotation, 4 years of corn, followed by 2 years of alfalfa, and 1 year of soybeans. He had a small herd of 40 beef cattle, and their manure was returned to the fields, feeding the soil, not just the plant. He planted cover crops in the winter, rye and hairy vetch, whose roots held the soil in place and added organic matter. His soil was teeming with life. It was a dark, rich chocolate color, and when you picked up a handful, it smelled sweet and earthy. It held water like a sponge. The organic matter in his soil was measured at 5.2%. His neighbor, Frank Miller's, was 2.8%. The difference was a visible line in the dirt, a line that separated two philosophies. One philosophy fed the plant, the other fed the soil. By 2015, Mark Jensen was no longer the eager 28-year-old. He was 40, a regional manager for AgriGen, driving a company Lexus. The Sunstone line had been replaced by the Hyperyield series. The farmers were now on Hyperyield 18. The price per bag was now $310. The recommended inputs were even higher. The farmers of Garrison County were on a treadmill. Their yields were high, consistently over 200 bushels in good years, but their costs had risen in lockstep. They were growing more corn than ever before, but they weren't making more money. They were running faster just to stay in the same place. They were producing a commodity, and the only ones consistently profiting from it were the suppliers and the processors. Mark stopped by Silas's farm one afternoon in June. He hadn't seen him in years. He found Silas on his front porch, oiling a piece of leather harness. Silas was 64 now, his hair completely white, his face a little more deeply lined. Mark, in his expensive polo shirt, looked out of place, but he was earnest. He was a true believer who had become a concerned friend. "Silas," he said, sitting in the other rocking chair. "I was looking at the county land valuations. Your acreage is assessed as the most productive soil in Garrison. It's a crime you're only getting 170 bushels from it." He pulled out his iPad, the modern version of his old briefcase. He showed Silas the projections for Hyperyield 18. With Silas's soil, he could be hitting 250 bushels. He showed him the potential revenue, an extra $75,000 per year. "You've made your point, Silas. You've proven you can do it the old way. But think of Thomas. Think of your grandkids. This is money you're leaving on the table." Silas finished his work on the harness, wiping the excess oil off with a clean rag. He looked at Mark, then at the old canvas seed bag which was hanging from its peg just inside the door. He'd brought it out to patch a small hole in the corner. He picked it up and held it in his lap. "Mark," Silas said, his voice soft, "your seed is an answer. It's a very smart, very expensive answer to a specific question. How do we get the most bushels in a single year?" He ran his calloused thumb over the hand-stitched seam. "This seed here, it's not an answer, it's a conversation. It's a question I ask the land every year. What worked? What survived? What do you need for next year?" And the land, it answers back. The answer is in the ears I harvest. Mark Jensen just shook his head. He saw a man trapped by sentiment, confusing a bag of seed with a holy relic. He didn't understand that Silas wasn't talking about mysticism. He was talking about information. Mark's seed had its information programmed in a lab in St. Louis. Silas's seed had its information programmed by 104 years of Garrison County weather, pests, and soil. Mark thanked Silas for his time and drove away in his air-conditioned car, certain he had just spoken to a man who had chosen poetry over profit. The year 2023 arrived. It was the 20th anniversary of Agrogen's entry into Garrison County. The latest product was a marvel of genetic engineering called Omnicorn 7. It was the culmination of a decade of research, a billion-dollar investment. Its key feature was a newly inserted gene that produced a protein called chitinase receptor 47, or CR47. This protein was designed to attack the digestive system of the western corn rootworm, a devastating pest that cost American farmers over $1 billion a year. The CR47 protein would be present in every cell of the plant, root, stalk, leaf, and kernel. It was, Agrogen declared, the final victory in the war against the rootworm. It would allow farmers to stop using soil insecticides, saving them money and reducing the chemical load on the environment. The rollout was massive. Agrogen phased out its other high-yield varieties in the region, making Omnicorn 7 the only logical choice for farmers wanting top performance. 98% of the corn acres in Garrison County, 56 farms, were planted with Omnicorn 7. The seed cost $350 a bag. The farmers didn't blink. This was the price of progress. The growing season was one of the best in memory. Ample rain in June, hot, sunny days in July, and a mild, dry August. The fields of Omnicorn 7 looked like something out of a dream. Every stalk was exactly the same height. Every ear emerged at the same node. The leaves were a deep, uniform bluish green. It was a breathtaking vision of agricultural perfection, a testament to humanity's mastery over nature. Projections for the harvest were a record-shattering 240 bushels per acre. Silas, now 72, and Thomas, 38, planted their 70 acres with Garrison gold, as always. Their fields, right next to their neighbors, looked almost shabby by comparison. The uneven heights, the slight variations in color. It was the aesthetic of a mutt next to a show dog. Thomas, who now ran most of the day-to-day operations, felt the old frustration stirring. He had 2 kids of his own, and the financial pressure was immense. He loved his father, he respected his principles, but he couldn't help but see the 70 bushel per acre gap as a failure. They harvested in late September. The yield monitor on their old Case IH combine flickered between 165 and 180. They averaged 172 bushels per acre. A good year for them. But across the fence, Frank Miller's new combine was pulling in a steady 245. The numbers were undeniable. Thomas stored their 12,040 bushels in their own grain bins, as they always did. They'd sell it slowly through the winter, hoping for a price bump. The rest of the county's 11.4 million bushels flooded into the massive elevators of the Garrison Co-op. The money began to flow. For a few weeks, the farmers of Garrison County felt like kings. The first sign of trouble came not from a government agency or a university lab, but from a feedlot in western Kansas. It was October 15th. The feedlot manager, a man named Ed Grimes, called his grain supplier. "The cattle won't eat this new cornmeal," he said. "They turn their noses up at it. The ones that do eat it, they get the scours. What the hell did you sell me?" The supplier traced the shipment back. It came from the Garrison Co-op in Iowa. The co-op manager was adamant. The corn was clean, dry, grade A. But more calls came in. From a hog farm in Missouri. From a chicken operation in Arkansas. The story was the same. The animals were getting sick. The Food and Drug Administration was notified. They pulled samples from the Garrison Co-op. Their scientists isolated the problem within 48 hours. Let me tell you about the CR47 protein. It had been rigorously tested on insects. Its effect on mammals was studied in short-term lab trials on rats, where it was deemed safe. The assumption, the critical assumption upon which a billion-dollar product was based, was that the protein would denature, break down, when the corn was dried at high heat and milled into feed. The assumption was wrong. The CR47 protein was remarkably stable. It survived the drying process. It survived the milling process. And when ingested by mammals, it didn't just attack the digestive systems of insects. It bound to receptors in the gut lining of vertebrates, causing massive inflammation, nutrient malabsorption, and, in high doses, liver failure. The elegant solution had a fatal flaw, a flaw that was invisible until it was scaled up from a laboratory to a landscape. The recall notice was issued at 4 p.m. on Friday, October 28, 2023. It was not a press release at first. It was a quiet, devastating telex sent to every grain elevator and food processor in the Midwest. Cease, use, and impound all corn traceable to Garrison County, Iowa, 2023 harvest. Potential biological contamination. The news spread not like a wildfire, but like a rising tide, silent and unstoppable. By Saturday morning, every farmer in the county had gotten a call. Their crop, their entire year's income, was frozen. Worse, it was now a toxic asset. It couldn't be sold, it couldn't be used. It would have to be professionally incinerated at a cost of 70 cents per bushel. The farmers were not just facing a total loss of revenue, they were facing a bill for millions of dollars in disposal fees. The emergency town meeting was called for Tuesday night. It was held in the same Grange Hall where Mark Jensen had promised them the future 20 years earlier. The same fluorescent lights hummed, but this time they illuminated faces etched with sheer panic. The folding chair scraped the floor with a sound of pure dread. The 56 farming families were there, their life's work hanging in the balance. They weren't just losing money, they were losing farms that had been in their families for generations. Mark Jensen stood at the front of the room again. He was 48 years old, his hair was gray at the temples, and the unshakable confidence was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunted look. He was no longer a missionary. He was an undertaker. He read a prepared statement from Agrigen's legal department. It was filled with words like abundance of caution, thorough investigation, and unforeseen anomaly. He announced the creation of a $10 million compensation fund for the affected farmers. It sounded like a lot of money until you divided it by the $52 million in direct crop losses. It was less than 20 cents on the dollar. It was an insult. A farmer in the front row, Tom Gallagher's son, stood up. 20 cents on the dollar? Is that what my farm is worth to you? He shouted, his voice cracking. Another man yelled from the back. You lied to us! The room, a tinderbox of fear and betrayal, was about to ignite. Then another man walked to the front. It was Dave Hatcher, the county extension agent, a man everyone knew and trusted. He was 60 years old and had spent his life helping these farmers. He held up a hand for quiet. He held a single piece of paper. Folks, please, yelling won't help. The room settled. I just got off the phone with the state grain inspector's office. They've been running genetic tests on samples from every farm's harvest all weekend. The recall order applies to any corn that tests positive for the Omnicorn 7 genetic marker. He put on his reading glasses. His hand trembled slightly as he held the paper. I have the list of farms whose grain is subject to the recall. It's everyone who planted the Agrigen seed. He began to read the names. A roll call of ruin. Anderson, Bailey, Carter, Davis. He read 56 names, the pillars of the community, the families who had farmed this land for a century. With each name, you could feel the hope draining from the room. When he finished the list, he paused. He took off his glasses and looked toward the back row, where Silas Blackwood was sitting quietly with Thomas. The entire room, a single body of collective misery, turned to follow his gaze. 56 families, their faces a mixture of confusion and a dawning, impossible hope. Dave Hatcher cleared his throat. The only sound was the hum of the lights. He looked down at his paper one more time as if to be sure. He looked back up at Silas. The only corn in Garrison County certified safe for sale is the 12,040 bushels harvested from the Blackwood farm. The sentence was delivered without drama, a simple statement of fact, but it landed with the force of a thunderclap in the silent room. It was the climax of a 20-year story, the vindication of a man who had chosen a conversation over an answer. Nobody cheered, nobody applauded. There was only a profound, echoing silence, filled with the weight of what was lost and what, against all odds, had been saved. Thomas looked at his father. The old man's face was impassive, but in his eyes, Thomas saw not triumph, but a deep and abiding sorrow for his neighbors. In the months that followed, the story of Garrison County became a national cautionary tale. Agrigen's stock fell by 40%. The lawsuits piled up, a mountain of litigation that would take a decade to resolve. Mark Jensen quietly resigned, citing health reasons, and was never heard from in the agriculture industry again. 12 of the 56 farms in Garrison County went into bankruptcy within the year. The beautiful, uniform fields of Omnicorn 7 were plowed under in the spring, a green manure of broken promises. Silas Blackwood did not get rich. He sold his corn at a fair price, a 50-cent per bushel premium, enough to secure his own farm's future, but not enough to feel like he was profiting from his neighbor's despair. The most valuable thing he had was not the corn in his bins, but the Garrison gold seed in the old canvas bag. Starting in January, a new procession of visitors came to the Blackwood farm. They were his neighbors, the same men whose fathers had called his father a fool, the same men who had pitied him for 20 years. They came in their muddy work boots, holding their hats in their hands, And they didn't ask for a loan. They asked for something far more valuable. They asked for seed. Silas and Thomas spent the cold winter nights in the machine shed, a single light bulb hanging overhead, portioning out the Garrison gold into brown paper sacks. They gave each farmer enough to plant 10 acres, a start, a chance to rebuild. They charged nothing for it. Thomas, bagging the seed his great-grandmother had protected, finally understood the different kind of math his father had been talking about. "The seed belongs to the place, Dad," Thomas said one night, his voice thick with emotion. "Not to us." Silas just nodded, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. The inheritance had been passed. The system the farmers of Garrison County bought into had promised to eliminate risk. It used patents and genetic uniformity to guarantee a yield, to smooth out the unpredictable variables of nature. But it did not eliminate risk. It simply concentrated it. By linking 19,000 acres to a single genetic code, it created a single point of failure. A vulnerability so total that when it broke everything. Silas Blackwood never tried to eliminate risk. He managed it. He managed it by embracing the diversity that the system called inefficient. He managed it by trusting a slow, patient process of selection that had been tested not by computer simulations, but by 100 years of real seasons. What survives in the end is not the strongest, nor the most productive in a single perfect year. What survives is what has the deepest roots and the most diverse memory of how to bend in the wind. What survives is not the answer. It is the conversation.